Hi, welcome to Head Start, the podcast for race directors and the business of putting on races. It is May 2022, and whatever hopes and expectations we've all had of 2022 at the end of last year have started to materialize. Or have they? It's difficult to say how strongly our industry's recovery towards pre-pandemic levels has fared so far this year, particularly when we all individually get to see only parts of the bigger picture. Well, today, I'm delighted to be joined by two industry insiders who get to see as much of the bigger picture as any in our industry. Bob Bickle, founder of US registration's market leader Run Signup, and Chris Robb, CEO of Mass Participation World and a passionate advocate for the endurance events industry. Chris and Bob come armed with data and a deep understanding of our industry and where it's currently at, and they'll be discussing with me the latest data on event numbers and registration trends, as well as more profound questions like, is it time for race directors to be raising prices? A question I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves. Before we go into all that though, a quick reminder of how today's podcast was made possible, and that's through the support of our amazing sponsors. So many thanks to Run Signup, Race Directors' favorite all-in-one technology solution for endurance and fundraising events, now powering more than 26,000 in-person, virtual and hybrid events. And many thanks to RaceCheck, whose free RaceCheck review box widget can help you collect and showcase your participant feedback on your own website, helping you more easily convert website visitors into paying participants. Well, we'll be hearing a bit more from these two great companies a bit later in the podcast, but now let's dive into our market update with Chris Robb and Bob Bickle. Chris, Bob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks, Panos. Great to see you.
Well, thank you very much both for taking the time to come on the podcast. So today we're straddling a few time zones, it seems. Chris, you're in Singapore, is that right?
I'm in Bali, actually.
Oh, you're in Bali. Okay, great. Even more exotic. Bob, what exotic destination are you calling from?
I'm in southern New Jersey.
Awesome. Okay, that's great. Bali, New Jersey. Can I get you guys, first off, to just introduce yourselves for me? You're both very well-known quantities in the industry, but maybe not everyone on the podcast would know about you. So let's take it in turn. Chris, you want to say a couple of things about you and your background and what you do in the industry?
Yeah, thanks, Panos. So Chris Robb, the CEO and founder of Mass Participation World. And I've been in the industry now, I guess, 35 years and some gaps in between. I'm not 35 years old anymore, unfortunately. But I started off in Zimbabwe. I was born on a farm in Zimbabwe, organized my first event when I was 16. And this will now start to date me because my first event was to raise money to resurface our Cinder athletics track. And hopefully there's a few people on the call that remember the days of Cinder athletics tracks. I think, Bob, you're a similar vintage to me, so you probably do.
That's all I raced on, Chris.
Yeah, me too. And so, yeah, I organized a fun run for that and it stuck. I went to university in South Africa and did a bit of travel and ultimately ended up in Australia. And have had, an incredible journey. I'm very fortunate. Was road event supervisor on the Sydney Olympics, which was an amazing opportunity. And then JP Morgan came along as a client, and organized the JP Morgan Corporate Challenge in Australia. And they wanted to take that to Asia. And I had this wonderful opportunity to help them launch that in Singapore. And 17 years later, I'm still in Asia. Married with, we were talking earlier, my little 7-year-old son was saying goodnight as we started. I had the privilege of organizing the Singapore Marathon, which was 60,000 participants at its peak, created an event called Cycle Singapore, which came from an idea to 11,500 cyclists in Singapore and across the region. And then sold that business to Ironman and founded almost simultaneously Mass Participation Asia as a conference to kind of bring the industry together. That's now evolved into Mass Participation World. For obvious reasons, we haven't had any in-person conferences in Singapore, but hopefully that's going to be back soon. Engaging the industry globally, education, advocacy, research, consulting, lucky to be involved in a job that's my passion, and I love supporting and engaging with the industry globally.
Absolutely. And you have your own podcast or podcasts, I should say, Aid Station, right? And Global Updates.
That's right. Yeah. So Aid Station's been started at the pandemic. So that's now, I think we're at edition 121. I think we've been to about 54 countries with guests on that. And then a few weeks ago, I started, and I literally have just come off this week's edition of Global Updates. So I do that twice a month on the first Tuesday and the fourth Tuesday of the month, and literally just reach out to the network. So far, we've been having a theme every week. So today it was staff challenges and solutions, and that's obviously topical, and we might get into that later. But yeah, 15, 20 minutes live on Facebook and LinkedIn, and then transferred into a podcast for people to listen to.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to be touching on some of those later on today. Bob, you want to say a couple of things about yourself?
Well, I ran on cinder tracks in high school and college, and quite honestly, running was a very foundational element in my life and really important to me. Although I stopped competing after college, I got into software technology and hopped on the internet train in the 90s. I've been part of a number of at least somewhat successful kind of internet startup companies, mostly in the Java infrastructure area. In 2010, started up Run Sign Up really as a little side project, and got lucky and met this wonderful young man, Steven Sigwart. And he's the real reason why Run Sign Up's successful, just a genius, best software developer I've ever worked with. We just started building stuff and people liked it and used it. And by 2019, things had gone pretty well for us. We had, I think, somewhere around 20,000 events across the U.S. use us to sign up like 6-7 million people. And it's been a great ride. And the past couple of years have been very, very strange. And I guess we'll get into that as we go along here.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also sponsor this podcast, for which we're very thankful, ourselves and our listeners, for supporting the work we do here.
Well, just a comment on that. Like, I really feel there are certain people in this community that I call the endurance community who have really good hearts and souls and try to help others. And I think, Panos, that you're kind of one of those people. The support is really just out of admiration and trying to get good information out to people that are trying to put on races.
Well, you're very kind, Bob. Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate the kind words. I guess we all do our bit to support this great, very niche industry we're all in. So today, guys, we're going to have another market update episode. I say another one because we seem to be having more and more of those. I thought, like at the end of last year, that would be the end of it and there would be very little to update people on. But apparently, it seems we may not be quite there yet. So it's important to do this update because lots of people, particularly on our Facebook group, our Race Directors group on Facebook, Race Directors Hub, have continued to ask questions about registrations, participation. They don't feel like things have fully recovered, although perhaps they think they should have. But also because, quite interestingly, both of you over the last couple of weeks posted a couple of very interesting pieces on the Run Sign Up blog, respectively, for Bob, and on the Mass Participation World blog for Chris, on some issues that seem to be lingering in the market, even after we've sort of, officially called a close on the whole pandemic thing. And, things around loss of know-how and people moving on, and a bit of sort of like muscle atrophy in the industry that we're going to be getting into, that I think is very interesting for people to catch up on. Also, for people to also feel like they're not alone, because I suspect from reading things in the group that lots of race organizers are facing issues with local authorities, with permits, with other things, and they may suspect that, they may be particularly unlucky. And maybe we end up seeing that some of these things have become a little bit more ingrained in the period we find ourselves in. But before we go into all those specifics, let's start with a quick market update. And I guess Bob is probably best placed, at least, to offer a perspective on what's happening in the US. In terms of, I guess, 2019 being the year we all look back on as the last best year out there, how close are we to getting to those numbers, 2019 numbers, in terms of registrations and market recovery?
There's two ways to answer that. One is that if you look at events that happened in 2019 and happen so far in 2022, we're looking at down like 15 to 20%. So if an event survived, that event is typically down 15 to 20%. There's exceptions on the high end. We also have seen probably about 20% plus of the events that happen in 2019. And we track events that are over 500 participants, so they have at least some critical mass. That those events, about 20% plus have kind of disappeared over those 3 years. So that's kind of the number we're seeing. It was kind of hidden from us because we were tracking kind of our top level registrations and revenue and transaction volume and stuff like that. And we had grown, I think our Q1 report was 22 or 23% in terms of number of events on our platform. And the number of events and the number of registrations tracked perfectly parallel. They were both like 22 or 23%. So we thought, well, geez, the average size of an event is still the same. But we dug into it recently and put out that new blog with that new data. So, and that really resonated with a lot of people. Like, I can't believe how many calls and emails I got as a result of that blog. And people were like, you're exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. There's a lack of energy. Things are down. It's just, it's tough for the individual race.
So race for race, you say sort of like for like races that were around 2019, those are 20% down in registrations. And then I also read in one of your pieces that because you track data across the industry, that looking at running in the USA data entries, that's also down sort of actual event numbers by another 20%.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, what we saw in terms of just the atrophy in races above 500 was typical of what happened. And I think that there's relatively few green shoots yet. So, kind of, and this is probably skipping ahead on your questions, but I think what's going to happen is because there's fewer events out there, I think that it presents an opportunity for new events to get created and new energy to kind of come into the community.
Absolutely. Chris, what's your take from what you're seeing across the rest of the world?
I guess the answer is there's quite a vast discrepancy from market to market. But, as a generalization, I just had my global update, as I shared, and I got some numbers from Pierre de Villeroy from Nuco, who Bob would I'm sure know. He's reporting 20 to 30% drop across Europe. And I'm hearing bigger numbers in some of the other markets, and as low as, as much as 40% drop in some markets, recognizing that in the Eastern hemispheres, things are really just starting to come back in some markets. China's gone backwards again. We've now got this phenomenon in many parts of Asia where we've just come out of Ramadan. So a lot of the Muslim countries have kind of closed down and had a bit of a pause, but also we're going into the monsoons and the hot parts of the year. So, the Bangalore 10K is happening in India this week, but it's a kind of an outlier. Normally their season's kind of shut down there. There's a few events starting to trickle back in other parts. They just had the Ironman Vietnam at the weekend, and that was a little down, but a successful event. Numbers in Australia seem to start being returning. The number that I got given for New Zealand is a lot of events only at 65% of 2019 levels. And they've had a bizarre season where the way that it worked for them, they literally had a month of events. So, those got crammed in. Things are starting to come back now. So I think quite a long way behind. I got some stuff out of Ethiopia from Doug Mwetawari at Great Ethiopia Run. They are clawing back the numbers, but controlled because of lingering COVID still. You might have seen some of the stuff on Comrades and Two Oceans. Comrades is way behind, but it's got some way to go. They had a successful Two Oceans, I think 20 to 30% off if I'm right, but a great signal to the industry. The numbers out of Latin America, real positivity, but still numbers down, sort of 20, 30% down on what they were in 2019 levels. So I think lagging behind where the US is at, but starting to get some nice momentum in summary.
If we tried, for what it's worth, to look back and rate our own biases and expectations on what this time in 2022 should have looked like, looking forward from 2021. I know, like lots of people in fall of 2021 were predicting that maybe by this time it would have been a lot closer to a full recovery. How well do you think we did back then? Are we where we thought we would be? Are we ahead or are we behind?
I think we're definitely behind where we thought we would be. We did our 2022 budgeting in October and November. Omicron was not big yet in the US. And so the numbers that we're hitting in March, April, May, June are going to be lower than what we had anticipated back then. Our January and February numbers were kind of what we had anticipated because we saw Omicron coming, but we thought that the recovery after that, the thing that we totally missed, and, because we just didn't look at this, is that the existing base of customers were going to take a hit of 20%. And that would still be existing in the springtime after Omicron wave.
And I think if you were to look at the other parts, Panos, way behind. I think, because of the shutdowns that have happened, massive loss of the industry across the region. So Australia, they're talking 20, 30%, which is maybe comparable to what Bob was talking about, 20% in America. But then you look at Thailand, they're talking about 80% of the industry gone there. You hear anything in between that in other parts of the world. India now, most of the big events have missed 3 editions. So the Mumbai Marathon will fundamentally have missed 3 years before they come back in February next year. So, I think, and we'll talk about commercial models later, but the knock-on impact of that is absolutely enormous, way behind in many of those other markets.
And do we think that all of that can be basically attributed to Omicron and the effect that has had on the market and maybe, lingering psychology of participants not wanting to come back and race?
I think it's a combination, Panos. I think at least half of it is on the event organizers, and the other half is the psychology. It's not necessarily the wave. I think people have kind of gotten used to waves. And here in the US, I think that there's decreasing concern as waves build. Like there's a wave that's building now in the US. And overall, I'd say that the amount of concern is continuing to decrease, whether you're on the right or the left, you're blue or red. And what I mean by on event organizers is that I feel Chris was just talking about Mumbai hadn't happened in 3 years. Like the event organizers just naturally kind of lose some of their enthusiasm. Some of the people that were there have gone on to other things. And there's you just kind of forget what you did 3 years ago. And then you have, as an event organizer, you have to have this concern of, well, what happens if a wave comes, right? And so like us, we had a symposium planned at the end of January and had spent a bunch of money and actually ate a bunch of money to put that on, and it got canceled. Couldn't have it at all. Very disappointing from an emotional perspective. And, you go through these troughs of repeated emotional disappointments. I think the event organizers at the end of the day are just a little bit hesitant to really put a lot into it.
My sense is that Omicron maybe masks some underlying market fundamentals, the challenge to the business model, which we'll talk about a little bit further, I'm sure. But also, I think in many markets, there was an erosion of trust in the consumer. Some people handled their refund policies well, others didn't handle it well. There was such a discrepancy. And I'm still hearing elements of that. People are saying, I'm not sure what your stats are, Bob, but, the stats that Pierre's got is the peak of the bell curve has moved a full 3 weeks closer to event day. What is that about? Maybe it's about people being indecisive. Maybe it's about them, and this is speaking for Europe, maybe it's about them not being fit. But I think part of it's more around the trust element. We want to see if this event's really going to go ahead. We want to see if there's another wave. So yeah, maybe COVID links to that. But we've got a massive, I think, consumer confidence issue. And as Bob's pointed out, many people, I was speaking to Hugh Braysher a while ago, and this real concern that people have fallen out of love with participating. They've forgotten the vibe of being in a group. Some people think it's this kind of fear of not coming back. I think it's less about the fear than we're out of the habit. We do other things now. We've filled our lives with different things.
It's interesting because Bob, I think in your Q1 business update, I read a point you made there about early signups, which is what Chris was referring to there, and the fact that not having early signups in itself has second order adverse effects, because then you don't have a substantially a large enough group of people to then refer others early enough into the race. So you get that kind of like knock-on effect.
Yep. Yeah. There's a network effect that happens where we used to call it viral. We can't call it that anymore, but word of mouth is the positive way to say it now. And, like if I signed up for a race that was going to happen in the summertime in January, I would tell my friends, but now I'm not going to tell my friends until I sign up for it, the 2 weeks beforehand. And then that network effect doesn't have a chance to take hold as much as it used to.
Yeah, which is also very practical, right? Because you guys also at Run Sign Up and others, you have peer-to-peer referral infrastructure, right? You have lots of things that basically each sign up is a kind of like, 1.2, say, signups kind of thing, right? Because every new member you bring on board, it has like an additional 20, 30% of encouraging others.
Yeah, a number of our customers use this functionality called referral rewards. And like if you sign up for an event, you have a special code that you can give to other people. And when they sign up, we track that. And if the race director can say, okay, if you get 5 people to sign up, you get $20 off, or you get your full entry fee back. And the ROI on it is like incredible. It's like 1,000% plus. It's really amazing how that works. And we track those stats, and the referrals are really powerful. They're, depending upon how aggressive the race is, it's 10 to as much as 40% of participants come through that referral program.
Do we have a sense then, this being one of the issues, whether perhaps organizers going a little bit more aggressive with their early bird pricing or other early sign up incentives might help with this situation?
I think so. Yeah. So we are seeing some of our kind of more aggressive, higher energy race directors doing that sort of thing. So they're pulling out more stops, and so that's why the 20% down is everybody, but you have these few bright stars that are figuring out ways to break out and still kind of bring people together.
So if we try to just get into the head of each of the 3 constituents in the industry, say the organizers, the participants, and then other stakeholders like local authorities and stuff. I know you guys have your finger on the pulse of the market in different ways. What's your feeling of where the race organizer mentality is at this stage? You both mentioned that, there's a little bit of a hesitance in investing and maybe people holding back a little bit. Do you have any concrete examples or any kind of like recurring themes from your discussions with people on what's really in the minds of organizers?
I'm hearing survival a lot. We're in survival mode. It's really hard. We're exhausted. Everything's really challenging. I had some quotes, and I won't name the person, but the next 6 months is about trying to generate enough cash flow to survive until 2023. When we hope we'll be in, and this was a quote from Asia, we'll be back to 80 to 100% of 2019. So I think there's very much that, it's survival. It's really challenging on many different levels, from supply chain to staffing to the entry and where, we're on a treadmill that's running really fast and just trying to stop being blown off the back of it, I think.
Yeah. If you look at race organizations in the U.S., even the largest ones are very small businesses, right? And they all had lots and lots of struggles to get through the pandemic. In addition, if like the top 100 races only represent like 5 or 6% of the total number of participants. So it's that long tail that really makes up the majority of the community. Those are made up of like individual people that are a timer, that have a van and go out and time races and things like that. And they basically got no income over the past couple of years. And so they had to find alternative things to do. And a number of them simply went out of business. So they're not in the business anymore, right? They may have tried to sell their equipment and things like that and got 50 cents on the dollar for their equipment, but it was tough for them. And then you take organizations, so nonprofit organizations, and I'll give you the example. So the reason Run Sign Up came along is I became involved in the Scott Coffey Run, and it's a run put on by the local Rotary Club. I'm not a member of Rotary, but I became involved in this anyway. And so we usually have our organization meeting in January for a June race. And this year we didn't have the organization meeting until April. And the committee was down by 2 very enthusiastic members because they had left the area. And there were not replacements because the number of people that are going to the weekly Rotary lunches is down by half. So they just don't have the people that are part of the club anymore. And the general level of enthusiasm was just down in the room. And people were like, what do we do to get the bagels? Who gets those? And, it's just like, just the energy was kind of lacking, and they had to do it because it's their biggest fundraiser of the year. But I just sat there in that room and I was like, this is what's happening in thousands and thousands of these races that are getting organized. And this is the reason why we're down 20%. So it just became really crystal clear, because at the end of the day, it's just people, and people are tired. They've gotten used to sitting and watching Netflix and not getting out. And, I think as both of you have said, people found other things to do, and it's going to take them a while to kind of get back to IRL communities and being together with people.
It's going to be, as you mentioned earlier as well, everyone can sense it should be incredibly demoralizing, this start-stop thing. You try to put on your event, another wave comes, you try to get it back into the water, but you're not exactly sure. So it takes its toll on you, I'm sure. And Chris, you must have heard similar stuff from even much larger races across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, like you say, the finish line is, it's kind of the analogy of starting the marathon, and, every time you run another 5Ks, the finish line gets moved further and further down the track. And, how do you adjust for that with all the unknowns and then all the staff issues that come with that? So just in a simple business sense, I mean, one of the statistics that I quoted on tonight's call, and this was a statistic from France, some organizations with 80% new staff. A guy that I get a lot of insights from, Marcel Altenberg, who's a crowd scientist who, Marcel, Marcel's telling me that many large size events, 40% of their key staff are seeing that event for the first time. So decision makers in key roles, start line finishers, course managers, start line managers, course managers. So the amount of energy that's being poured into the recruitment process, the onboarding process, I was talking to Mike Nishi, and, he's talking about the amount of time that he's spending in terms of onboarding staff, making sure that, going through a very, very strong due diligence to make sure that you get staff that are aligned to your purpose and are going to be there for a long time and so on. But it all takes time and energy. And when you're managing, your cash flow challenges around that, your permitting issues, which are, we can talk about later as well, are challenging. It's really draining for entrepreneurs. And, as Bob said, many small businesses with, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, maybe 15 staff at most, represent a large part of this industry. And many of them, Kirsten from Canada with Kirsten Fleming was saying, many of them have just put up their hands and said, too hard, I'm just going to sell my permit. And, I've lost the love for it. I've lost the passion. Can't do it. I used to get one piece of paper. I now need 20, and I'm taking all this commercial risk to go with it as well.
Yeah. I mean, it was never, I have to say, having tried it for a couple of races, putting on races was never an easy job. Even in the best of times, right? I mean, it's a very challenging business. And then to have all of these things to also contend with, I mean, it can get really, really stressful. I think resilience and the whole mental health of the industry is also something we want to look a little bit closer at. These churn rates we're seeing in terms of resignations and people moving on are not particularly unique to our industry, though. I mean, it's something that's happening sort of globally, right?
Absolutely. And I think it presents some great opportunities for those that are willing to look at them. We've obviously lost, I think one of the challenges in our industry is that there's a lot of it that can't be taught in a university or a school. You know, the experience of being able to walk onto an event site and understand what's going on and to be able to respond in split seconds to situations often comes with experience. And that for me is the fear that we've lost decades of experience. I have no doubt that we're going to have an amazing industry. Is that going to be 2 years' time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time? I think there's going to be a real need for our industry. And, you know, what I think as an industry we need to guard against is we lose this decades of experience, both in race directors, but also in volunteers. And they're probably going to be replaced by what's been missing for many years are the young tech-savvy entrepreneurs, but they don't necessarily then have the operational skills. So the industry is at risk again, where these people come in, they have the skills to market. And we saw a lot of it in Asia. As the industry exploded in Asia, events would go from 0 to 10,000 participants in their first edition. And you had inexperienced people putting these events on, people getting injured, sponsors getting burnt, and so on. So as an industry, how do we mitigate that risk of saying, well, it's going to be great to get people that get the whole generating more revenue side of things. But if they don't have the operational skills and we're on the front pages for all the wrong reasons, there's an equal risk. So, I think there's going to be wonderful opportunities, but there's going to certainly be challenges as we go through this transition.
I always see the glass half full. I see it as a wonderful opportunity where, kind of things have died down and now there's a better opportunity if I want to go out and start an event. I'll use our own company as an example, is that, we kind of really focused and fought through this entire pandemic and put a lot of energy in. We did not lose an energy at all during the pandemic. And we've benefited greatly. Like the industry might be down 20+%. Or even 40% if you add on the number of, races that have not reoccurred and the lower numbers per race. And we're growing 20%. And the reason is because, we're just that kind of entrepreneur that is finding the opportunities and is pushing hard. And we see customers doing that. We see some of our customers, kind of taking the opportunity and kind of moving forward. Yeah, it's tough and all that, but geez, there's fewer competitors out there for them. There's less 5Ks that are happening in the neighborhood. I'm kind of optimistic for the next year. I think the fall is going to be better. And I think that next year is going to be a pretty good year.
It's still a challenging market out there, and whatever hopes we've all had of a full recovery to 2021 numbers seem to have been a little bit premature, unfortunately. And it's been a very hard time for all you guys out there putting on races, whether it's through a non-profit, a for-profit, or a local running club. Well, hopefully you're not giving up just yet. And as Bob said, this is maybe even the time to be bold and to be looking to improve and grow the races you already put on. For those of you looking to do that, there's one platform that can really up your game across almost every aspect of your event, from the way you take registrations to how you market your race and even how you manage your event on race day. And that's Run Sign Up. I keep banging on about Run Sign Up because beyond the great people I frequently get to speak to over there, I hear great things about Run Sign Up all the time from the hundreds of Run Sign Up customers that are part of our Race Directors HQ community. And that's all stuff you just can't fake. So take just a minute, and go visit runsignup.com. Have a look at the features they have to offer. And if you have any questions or want to see more of those tools in action, just click to book a free demo. It's right there at the top of the page. Give it a try. 26,000 races can't be wrong, Okay, now let's get back to the episode. In terms of where the participants' minds is, I know that, Chris, you've been tracking the actual factual effects of COVID on participation and the fact that, there's been maybe like 2 or 3 infections among like millions of participants in events through the pandemic. Do we feel that despite that, people are quite apprehensive about getting out on those start lines again?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the statistics were amazing. And, again, I think to qualify it, it was just a simple self-reporting, events giving us their data. But, we stopped the study a couple of weeks ago because we reached the milestone of 10 million participants with only 5 reported COVID cases in 36 countries. My sense is from everyone I'm speaking to, it's less about apprehension of getting on a start line. And Bob's nodding there. I think, there's seldom anyone I speak to who says participants are worried to get onto a start line. I think it's more about what we spoke about before, out of the habit, doing different things. There's no doubt that there's going to be some tough economic times coming. Interest rates are increasing, inflation's going to come through, and I think sometimes our industry is, and I don't have any stats that I've looked at to back it up, but we're probably an industry that is more recession proof in that, because it's less of a disposable income. It's getting out there. It's being able to engage. There's a degree of escapism in it, maybe. But as I say, I don't have any stats to back that up.
I do have stats to back that up, Chris. So I actually co-owned a running store for a while back in the 2000s. And during the 2008 recession, running stores did bonkers business then, because not everybody lost their job, not everybody was bad, and so it might not be cool to go out and buy an expensive car, but to go and buy a pair of shoes, and even if you were kind of constrained in terms of your entertainment dollars that you could spend, buying a pair of shoes and going out and running and spending $35 on a 5K is not that extravagant.
It's an interesting point also that, I had Peter Abraham on the podcast that you both know a few episodes back, talking about branding. And we were discussing the challenges that events, regardless of the pandemic, face in people thinking through how to allocate their dollars. And he was saying that, like an event these days may be $100, then, add this and that to it. And then for 2 people to go out and race, maybe even out of town, it comes up to a few $100s, and people might think, I can either race or do something else, which to me, that I do a couple of races a year that I really love, I seem to have like a different kind of like wallet for my racing budget. I wouldn't think of it as fungible, but do we feel that's the case, that maybe as disposable income gets a little bit tighter, that people would actually have to make those decisions between going out on a race or, going out to the theater, say, or doing something completely different?
Well, yeah, I mean, everybody has to make their own decisions on that. But I think that people have plenty of money to go out and sign up for a race. And while, yeah, it may hurt some of the events where there's travel involved, I think most people are going to races that are within a 25 or 50 mile radius of their homes. I don't have exact stats on that, but that's my gut feel. So I think it's that people have gotten used to doing other things over the past 3 years, rather than they're not willing to spend, 0.05% of their budget on signing up for a race.
I would second that. And also I think that there's a great opportunity for more experiences and boutique experiences, people going out of town for a weekend, and, that maybe you said, well, you don't travel, but my sense is that there is an opportunity to put on more of an experience than a race, where people go away, within not a long distance from home. And some of the statistic from Sports Travel Magazine, from Jason, was that people were actually prepared to travel further domestically than they were prior to the pandemic to go and have those kind of experiences in other towns and so on. So I think people who get the mix right around the experience and the run, the triathlon, the whatever it may be, I think that there's great opportunities there. Going away with the family, people want to reconnect. I think more and more people have reconnected with nature and the outdoors and things. So I think it maybe means a challenge for more urban events. City events may be more challenged. And from that perspective, I mean, you've seen the massive boom in what's happening in trail running, no doubt. And, what's happening in gravel biking. People are wanting to reconnect with nature. The setup and delivery costs of those kind of events are lower. Obviously, the capacities in some instances might be limited. So, but it seems to me, without huge experience and interrogation of the business model, that those are probably going to be more sustainable, and there'll be interest in being able to go and do those.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, I think it makes sense that when things come back, you have a different appreciation of your time, and maybe you want to try and aim to do events that have something to offer in terms of experience, that, you may not just go and run your local, non-distinct race that, over the weekend, and you may just save yourself to go and do those other events. In terms of no-show rates, I know Bob obviously has the experience from Run Sign Up and the data there, and you, Chris, had some thoughts on that in your recent pieces. Do we have any idea what no-show rates are doing currently in the industry?
Yeah, I just got some interesting stuff again from Peer today, that in Europe, those have now dropped to 10% over the last couple of weeks. In other markets, I'm still hearing that around 20-25% in some markets. But yeah, it was interesting that across Europe on a basket of events that have happened in the last couple of weeks, that seems to, I've for a long time seen 10% as kind of like the norm pre-COVID. There was an example that, totally contradicts that. There was, I think it was the Cardiff Half Marathon, which you may be aware of, Panos, 2 weeks ago, 52% no-show rate. And obviously, that's probably being skewed in many parts by the deferred entries. People just now having to say, well, I've got to kind of check it in before I lose it. So I'll say I'm going to go and then I don't go. So I think it's hard to get a true read on what that means. But obviously, from a P&L perspective, it's a huge impact. And that's that combined with that issue of late registrations. How do you order your T-shirts, your medals, and even your kind of perishable supplies of, your water and your bananas, and, how many volunteers do you need and all that kind of stuff. So it definitely has a P&L impact, and it seems to be leveling off in some markets, but it's still very variable in others, is what I'm seeing.
Bob, any insight on the US? What's happening with no-show rates?
I don't have any hard data that I prepared for this. I'll publish something later on in the coming weeks on that, because we have technology for timers and we track that, and we've not seen anything unusual. So my assumption is that we're still about 10%. And that makes sense to me because people are kind of more cautious about signing up. And therefore, if they're signing up, they're going to be more conscious about making sure that they attend.
Okay. Now, in terms of, I guess, the one thing that may not be obvious to everyone, and of course, every race director has their own personal experiences on that. So it might be useful for us all to inject some broader statistics on this. What's happening with local authorities, with the people, like giving out the permits, supporting races on the ground, welcoming or not welcoming, in some rare cases, races back into their communities? What do we think is the feeling and the situation on the ground there with the people that, stand on the other side of the fence, working with race organizers to bring on events locally?
They're kind of the same thing as race organizers. The story I told you of race organizers, they're like, oh, geez, you're back? You want to run out? You want us to close down the roads? Do you know how much of a pain it is to close down Main Street to have your Scott Coffee run? Oh, geez. Some local cities are just, kind of tamping down even more, and it's becoming more difficult, more expensive. Police rates are increasing, and it's a major source of frustration in the U.S.
That's mirrored, and it comes back to the Great Resignation as well. Massive staff turnover in the last 2 years, so many people turning up to go and apply for a permit, speaking to someone completely new who's come in from a different department, maybe, who's got no history with the event. Resourcing is a huge issue. So you might be aware of this, Bob, the Illinois Marathon, which, if I'm correct, is a marathon, a half marathon, a 10K and a 5K, or I might have the lesser distances. They couldn't get a permit for their marathon because there were not enough police to be able to close the roads. I heard a story, I think it was in Dallas, 50 to 60 police headcount short to be able to close a road, no permit at all for the event. I'm hearing some issues in other countries of just councils now emboldened and empowered by COVID because they've been able to enforce other COVID-related rules, and are now putting, I'm more powerful than I was before in minimal experiences. But certainly some of that happening. I'm not now more of a powerful council member, and I'll flex my muscles and make it difficult for you. But then, I had some feedback from some people saying that they're not aware of events that are not getting their permit if they come with a collaborative approach. They've got a good plan. They've been flexible. If I'm the old-fashioned race director that's been around for 20 years and it's like, I don't need that young whippersnapper behind the counter telling me that I need a permit and I need to do this and do that, yeah, you're probably going to now be encountering problem. But if you come in recognizing that both sides have a challenge, as Bob said, you don't want us to close down the main street because, we got the shop owners protesting and the hotels and the people can't get to church and all the events that every event deals with, but they have to deal with those. And I've always said, put myself in the shoes of the permitting authorities and understand what the problems they have to solve, and let's solve them together. And we're more likely to get an outcome that's beneficial, as opposed to, I'm the marathon that's been here for 20 years and I need to get my permit again. Surprise, surprise, you're probably not going to get your permit in the new world that we live in. So certainly hearing of people being asked to provide extra staff, extra barricades. And I think, again, with the glass half full, this possibly presents an opportunity for the industry to come together in an area and say, okay, let's work together as all the events that are here. And why don't we go to the council and put a solution together and train up more of our volunteers to be traffic managed, trained, and all those kind of things, and find a solution that's going to benefit everyone. And I think, one of the real goods that's come out of this is collaboration. And if I go back to, when I started in the industry and in the most simplistic term, and it still happens in some parts, you'd finish an event and you'd get a flyer for all the events that were coming up. What were we doing? We were fundamentally sharing databases, weren't we? But if you go to someone now and say, cross-promote to your database and advertise my event on your Facebook page, some people do it, but most people would say, oh, why would I do that? I can't do it. But that's how the industry was founded during the running boom. We were all sharing each other's databases in an old-fashioned way. And that degree of collaboration, I think, can help with the rebirth in these areas that are struggling.
I mean, it's interesting you bring that up. We had a couple of comments in the group as well around this point that I didn't personally expect make some sense, I guess, that businesses and local businesses may be seeing the case of events being put on in their area and disrupting the regular flow of business with a slightly different perspective, actually. So, you often see some antagonism now, not only from local residents, like some residents that, always raise some issues around that, but also local businesses being a little bit more reluctant to sign off on these things, or maybe, jump on the train of, oh, this is going to bring new people to the area, the economic impact case. By the way, since you raised this point, Chris, I'm wondering, since I have the both of you here, there had been some effort, speaking of collaboration, of some organizations being formed during the pandemic to promote the interests of the industry. We had, several sort of like endurance industry and endurance alliance across organizers and other stakeholders in different countries, in Canada, in the US, in California. There was one in the UK. Do you guys have a sense for how effective those were, and generally as an industry, how well we responded in terms of like coming together and fighting a case for the industry during the pandemic?
My sense is that it's been a struggle, and quite a lot of them, unfortunately, are losing steam now. And so it depended a little bit on what their kind of terms of reference were. Some of them were set up as lobbying groups to get funding and get approvals for events. Others of them have taken so for example, AMSI, the Australian Mass Participation Sports Events Alliance, is really looking at a long-term legacy of education and collaboration and so on an ongoing basis. Some of them have moved. I'm aware of, the endurance, and I always get the Canadian and American one mixed up. You might need to help me, Bob. Endurance Sports Coalition, I think, is in America, isn't it? So they've passed their responsibilities or their work to Running USA, and Running USA is now driving that. My sense in Canada is that, it's a couple of people that are driving it. A very huge amount of work went into CISO in France. and they have a formally registered organization, as AMSI does. They have all of the major federations on board, running, cycling, triathlon, and so on. And the feedback I've had this week is they're really struggling to get the industry to sign up. And I think, in my sense, that's a shame, because I think that if we'd had a bigger voice as an industry globally ahead of this, I think that we might have had an opportunity. We'll never know, but might have had an opportunity to come out of this sooner than we did. We were always at the back of the queue. Stadium events were coming back. And the analogy that I often drew was, you saw the seating bowl with scattered people in it, but the best analogy was people going into a stadium and leaving a stadium. That's exactly what's happening on a start line. It was allowed to happen with people going into a stadium or in the concourse, and the picture you saw was in the bowl. But those organizations have this lobbying power and the commercial power that our industry hasn't managed to do. I'm not saying it's easy, but if we can continue to build this collaboration and representation, and the thing that there's a real dearth of is research and data that backs up the impact that we make. I still don't think we make the case as an industry broadly, whether that be country by country, city by city, or globally, of the enormous impact that our industry makes, not only economically, but on the health and well-being of populations.
I think that it's a tough argument to make. I think it's a tough challenge. I mean, if you look at the U.S., people spend about $1 billion a year to sign up for races in normal times. And, $1 billion of transaction volume is just not very big. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was reading and thinking about lobbying, and different organizers and states were trying to figure out, how do we do lobbying to the federal government to get attention on the endurance community and things like that. And I was reading this article about Las Vegas and how much, and I can't remember the numbers, but one casino and how much transaction volume they process in a year. One casino is bigger than the entire endurance community. And so just our ability to really make an impact, I really became jaded by that. And then when you look around at the organizations that are part of this, Race Directors Hub is basically you, Panos, and that's created this virtual community. If you look at Running USA, it's only a couple people, and they're under severe economic pressure because most of their revenue comes from their conference. Conference attendance was down the past couple of years. The expo area was down, and so at the end of the day, we're all just a bunch of small little businesses trying to survive. And it's been a tough couple of years. And I think it was unrealistic to expect that we could impact things. And yeah, we could have done a better job maybe, but I think it was always kind of a doomed effort.
So, Bob, speaking of data, maybe you have some data on the number of races that don't seem to be coming back onto the market, in terms of races that used to happen and races that, on their scheduled dates, at least for more than a year even, may not be coming back. Do we have a sense for what that number may currently be running at, and what would be more like a steady state number from before the pandemic? Because, events just didn't repeat back then as well.
Yeah. So we've been tracking since 2017 this term called churn, and in software businesses, that's what you track to see the health of your business and stuff. And we track two types of churn, and we did it on a monthly basis. We've done it on a monthly basis since 2017, and we do it for only races that are over 500 on our platform that happen each month. And so we have been tracking that historically. So pre-pandemic, about 5 to 6% of races don't happen from one year to the next. And then we happen to lose between 1% and 2% to competitive churn for various reasons. Mostly that Gannett bought up in Motive, I Am Athlete, and Rugged Maniac. But anyway, the no race churn is really the considerable churn. And so the report that we just did includes those numbers in detail. But roughly speaking, from January to April, the number of races that churned was about 20 to 25%. If you take that 3-year hiatus, and you multiply the 6%, it's kind of in that same range that it always had been. So maybe a little bit more, but it is considerable when you take it over that period of time. And are things like they were in 2019? No, there's been at least a 20% shift just because that's the way the world always worked. But there's also been a little bit more pressure, and that's why there's a few more races not happening. Like I said, we are fortunate. So I'll give you the April number as an example. So in 2019, there were 241 races above 500 on our platform that happened in April of 2019, and 62 of those churned. So they did not happen in 2022, but we gained an additional 178. So this is why our numbers kind of are inflated some. So the problems underneath were kind of hidden from us.
And we don't have a sense, I guess, for those races, whether these are gone for good or whether they might come back a year down the line, I guess, or do we?
No, I would say 90% of them are gone for good.
I don't have access to much of that sort of data, except anecdotal. I shared earlier that, the folk in Thailand are telling me that 80% of races won't return. And, that's a combination of races and businesses. In Australia, they're saying 20 to 30, and maybe that's increased a little bit. So yeah, that those are kind of some of the examples that I have. I've heard 50% in some other countries, but not with any reliable data that like Bob's got. This is all just anecdotal. And again, in those markets with another cycle to go, I think that in quite a lot of these markets, we are going to see more pain in the next 6 months. I think there's a sense that, great, the pandemic's gone, we're coming back again, but the lack of reserves to restart the engine in some places, I think, is going to have, at the risk of sounding negative, it's going to have a significant impact in some places, I think. People have used a lot of reserves to survive. In 2019 at MPW in Singapore, the biggest conversation both on and off the stage was around the broken business model in most markets for large sections of the market. There's certainly sections that are making significant money, but a lot of kind of break even, small profit, small loss businesses. And so just in simple economic terms, you say entry fees mostly flat. And I'd love to get Bob's take on that in the US, but in most markets, I'm hearing, people worried to increase entry fees. The staff issues, input costs, generally, I'm hearing an average 20 to 30%, in some markets more. And then the impact of the staffing in any sector, that becomes a less sustainable business model. And then with the limited reserves that most of our industry has, and, there's some concerning signs. I've heard some stories of 2023, we spoke about registration trends, but some 2023 events already selling out, and even at 10% more, based on a similar entry level to 2019. And without any proof, my gut feel is that has to be a cash flow grab to try and sustain over the next 6 months. And that potentially creates a huge stain on our industry. And again, I'm not trying to be negative here, but, we spoke about trust earlier on of people not getting their refunds. And we now have a bunch of events that are taking entry fees that don't survive. And then, they can't even give a credit for a next year's event. It's just gone. And then the suppliers that get bought down in the process of that, I think in some markets, we're going to see more challenges in the next 6 months as we head towards, and that might be quite a lot of the Asian markets, but it wouldn't surprise me to see quite a lot of the mid-tier go under. I think the top of the pyramid's got the resources. The smaller 2 and 3 person, passion projects, the not-for-profits that have got no and low overheads would be fine. But the mid-tier, I think, is going to struggle significantly unless, and, I'm asking the question, I'm seeing some aggregation happening in markets like the US, but I asked the question in other markets, and I'm not seeing much sense of investment of people coming in and aggregating and buying up events and so on. I hope I'm so wrong, but my sense is there's going to be more pain to come from the next kind of 6 months as people try and find the resources to restart the engine.
Did you know that in a recent survey, 73% of responders said that reading reviews influences which races they enter? Well, RaceCheck is the largest aggregator of race reviews in the world and has collected over 40,000 race reviews for over 6,000 events globally. So how can you collect more reviews for your event and make the most of them to increase your race registrations? Well, you can start by listening to our Power of Race Reviews podcast from September 20th last year. There's plenty of tips there on growing your race reviews. And then visit organizers.racecheck.com. That's organizers with an S.racecheck.com to download your free RaceCheck review box so you can start showing all your race reviews on your website for an instant boost to your race's social proof and conversions. It really is a no-brainer. So go to organizers with an S.racecheck.com and download your free RaceCheck review box today. Okay, now let's get back to the episode. In terms of entry fees, I thought you made a very interesting point in your paper about the elephant in the room and the broken business model. And I think I was looking at the race trends data from the last Run Sign Up report from last year, and it's a little bit difficult to compare like for like because of the effect of virtual events in there. But it seems like there's no rush for people, and I've interviewed a couple of race directors on this, to hike prices despite what's happening, which is fairly existential in some cases. Why is that the case? Because everyone is hiking prices left, right, and center. I mean, inflation, increased costs are starting to trickle in through the cost of organizing events, and people are they're hesitating from rising prices. Why would that be?
I'll tell you why. What's the reason that all three of us got into this community? It's because of passion, right? And all the people that or most of the people that are organizing these races also got into it for passion. What I see by and large is not necessarily business people running these organizations. It's passionate people. And they just don't want to harm the participants. And they are so anxious to get participants back. They think if they raise the price by $5, they're not going to get as many participants back. And I think that's, I was thinking when Chris was talking and he was just talking all economics, right? And that at the end of the day is what drives it. But I think that the passion is kind of leveling it out. And so at least in the US and our customer base, I feel a little bit more positive that we're not going to have catastrophes. We're not going to have people showing up, 1,000 people showing up and there's no race there and stuff. I'm a little bit more hopeful on that front. At the end of the day, though, their net income is not going to look good over the next couple of years until they adjust. And people are going to need to raise prices. That's just a simple fact. I've had a couple discussions with passionate race directors that also care about the economics of it because they have to pay a mortgage and so forth. And that's a simple fact that's going to happen.
But what's your thought actually, Bob, on the price elasticity point? Do you believe that raising prices is going to drive people away or not?
No, I don't think it will. I think people are going to come back. I think people are slow to come back just because they're out of the habit. But Netflix just increased prices to everybody, right? By 10% or so. And yeah, they had like 0.1% of people turn off their Netflix accounts. I think you'll have a 0.1% people that decide not to run the Scott Coffee race because we raised the price from $30 to $35. But we kept it at 30 this year just because that's what we've always done. And we don't want to change things. And this little race I'm involved in, I think it's a microcosm of what everybody else is going through. And it's just the reality, practical, what happens with common sense at the end of the day. But I will bet you that we raise it to $35 next year.
Yeah. And Chris, I guess you agree with that in terms of elasticity and the effect raising prices might have on participation overall?
Yeah, I think so. And again, I think it's, if we're talking across a basket of events, I think at the lower level, less so. An interesting example, the PTO launched their triathlon and they marketed that at a premium level and they had to back off and reduce their entry fees. That remains to be seen what will happen in 2023 and as we move beyond. I think inevitably it has to go up. My concern is without putting it up in the next 6 months, can these businesses survive? Even the passion projects. And, we're so right, that base of the pyramid is made up of thousands of these events. I worry from two perspectives. I worry from a cash flow perspective, but I also worry from a liability perspective. What are those unknowing, passionate event organizers doing in exposing themselves from a liability perspective if they're not able to put on the event because they've paid the deposit for the T-shirts and the medals, and then the cash flow is such that they can't pay the final one. And I think Bob's right. You're hopefully not going to have a whole bunch of 1,000 people events where people don't turn up. I'm more concerned. I think I'm talking about the mid-tier here, the bottom, the 500,000 people events. I think those will continue and sustain because they've got low overheads. They're probably mostly in places where they've got low staff overheads and they've got low delivery overheads because they're not closing down city centers. They're more in more kind of rural park-like locations, and the infrastructure is simple. But when you get into more of the staffing overheads and more of the the equipment and things that go in there where the prices have gone up significantly, that's where I think we might see some issues.
I think that's true for a purely professional organization, like a for-profit organization. I think in the mid-tier there is potential, but even those organizations are typically sponsored, by sponsors. They've got connections to nonprofits. They've got some sort of connection and support with a city and community building and things like that. And so we have a lot of those mid-tier events on our platform, the 1,000 to 10,000, person events. And we're seeing the leaders of those organizations are passionate enough to pull it off somehow, some way. Things are tight, but they're figuring it out. And that's kind of what we're seeing. And we're seeing, and we have measurements with NPS scores and things like that we track. And races, by and large, are doing a fairly decent job. So we've not seen a radical drop. We haven't had, knock on wood, but we haven't had any bad experiences yet. And that's with 1,000+ races happening, every month on our platform.
And I guess for those kinds of races, I think I tend to agree with Chris, are the most susceptible in terms of the bottom of the pyramid with the passion events and the really high-end, really multi-million-dollar operations. That middle layer of people who put on races for a living, they also now probably have to contend with the additional headwind of having some of the government support and loans, perhaps, that they entered into during the pandemic that have to be repaid. And right at the moment where, maybe some of them were expecting that would be out of it or that we would be at a better place, you have those payments kicking in that I think you mentioned in an article there, Chris.
Yeah, certainly that's, what I'm hearing across Europe is that, governments gave loans and they gave kind of 18-month honeymoon periods on those and those are being called in now and some people are struggling to be able to pay those back. And again, it's anecdotal from a couple of quarters. As a generalization, the structures in Europe are around not-for-profit, so I think maybe less of an issue there. But certainly that was the feedback that I had, is that they're struggling to be able to repay. In Asia, it's much more of a business model generally, so less of a club, less of a not-for-profit situation. And so I think many of those have struggled. We had this kind of, as the industry came here, we had this explosion of every man and his dog thinking that it was a profitable industry and they could jump into it and make a fortune. And the business model here is kind of completely the reverse. In most Asian countries, the entry fees are so low that without a government grant or a decent sponsorship, it's not commercially sustainable. So you have situations now where an event's been around for a number of years, they lose a sponsor or they lose a government grant, and they can't survive on the entry fee revenue that comes through. And so where you sit in the more evolved markets, for want of a better expression, US particularly and parts of Europe, is that the sponsors are almost kind of like the cream on the top, and the entry fee revenue sustains a large proportion of the P&L. It's very much a different model in this part of the world.
Yeah, in the US, the PPP program and the Employee Retention Tax Credit program were both fully like you didn't have to pay them back, basically. Only under rare circumstances did you have to pay them back. And so, Run Sign Up was certainly the beneficiary of those, and the government helped us through that time. We were able to retain all of our employees and actually grow our employee base because of those programs. But there's no clawback that's happening in the US. So we don't have that overhead. The only overhead that races see is if they deferred a bunch of participants from their 2020 or 21 race into 22 and 23. So they're not getting revenue. It's kind of like your story, Chris, of where people are selling 23 race entries, but is the cash going to last all the way until 23, right?
Yeah, that's sort of like, I guess in some cases, these deferrals, they almost act like having taken a loan out from yourself, from your future revenue. So, you got the cash to the door and now you have to deliver the event and you have all of those people wanting to come back and participate. Before we wrap up, I wanted to spend a minute. I was reading the latest race participant trends piece from Run Sign Up, which maybe you have authored actually, Bob. And I read this line in there that says,
"What did I say? Oh no."
Well, it's actually very interesting. It says, and I think pretty profound, that there has been, the report says, a disconnect that has grown between events and their participants. And we mentioned this point on loyalty and how that sort of like gap has grown. And I'm guessing, like during the pandemic, dates and locations shifting around between events didn't help much, like events rushing to come in the fall of the year when events opened up. Do we have any sense of practical steps, perhaps, that organizers can take to bridge that gap and rekindle some of that enthusiasm between races and the communities we serve?
I think direct, honest, open communication is the way to go. That's always been my mantra. And I think it comes down to this idea of loyalty and support. We have this term called supporter engagement, that organizations need to engage their supporters. They need to find ways to thank them, to reward them, to get them to contribute and feel a part of whatever that community is, whether it's a race or whatever. And so, again, it comes back to having the energy to do those sorts of things. It's having training programs before an event. It's, sending lots of emails. It's sending special coupons to, loyal customers. And, if you've run a race 2 times, you get 20%. If you've run it 3 times, you get 25% or something like that, can really have an impact. If you open up races, and say, okay, this opening is just for our loyal customers and the special price is just for our loyal customers. And also just asking directly, we need your support. You've always supported us. You've always been there for us. We need your help now more than ever. So I think communicating like that and doing it in an aggressive, open, authentic way is the way to go.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Bob said. And I think it's also asking them what they want as well. I think sometimes as racers, we kind of assume that, because we've been doing this for 5 years, this is what we should do. Because we've been doing it for 10 years, we should do that. Consumers have evolved and COVID has meant an evolution. And, what's the, in any good business, what's the problem that we're solving for a participant? What's their pain points? How can we, because we did it like this in 2019, does that mean it's still what those participants want in 2021 and 22 and 23? Sorry, 2022 and 23. But, engaging with them in a way that is authentic and open, as Bob said, we want to hear from you. And I've been saying for a while that I think one of the biggest missed opportunities in our industry is this year-round engagement. And that's very easier said than done. But we have this opportunity where we've got this loyal group of followers who sign up to our events, who participate in them. And how often do you see a kind of a, dear Bob, entries have opened, please sign up. Thanks for signing up. Here's your training program. Here's your course map. Here's the details. Here's your e-certificate. But thanks. And then there's a deathly hush for another 3, 4, 5 months. And those same organizations will go out and spend money in various forms to try and acquire new customers when they're not engaging with those customers that they've got. We pretty much every event sits on a gold mine of their own data of people that have willingly subscribed to being part of their community. And I think, as a generalization, there's probably opportunities to engage with them. And the ones that have done that well during COVID, surprise, surprise, like Bob and his business are the ones that are reaping the rewards now.
Yeah, I think you both mentioned it, and it's something that comes up in discussions I'm having with marketing people who work with races, that year-round engagement is both a huge missed opportunity, even regardless of where we've been, and having to rekindle loyalty is something that events just need to get better at. There's huge opportunities there. When I was talking to Fitz Kohler and Steve Fleck on the Race Announcers episode, they were saying that for some events, even though races weren't happening, they did live events and other stuff for their runners throughout the pandemic. And that's what events should have done, right? Keep people involved, maybe go out, put a community run on, or just try to get people to feel like they're still connected with a brand, which of course brings us to one final issue in all this and one final stakeholder, which is the sponsors. And one discussion I had with Ben Pickle in an earlier podcast, who does all the sponsor partnerships for lifetime events, is that, and asked him, what new approach would you take to sponsorship now after the pandemic? And he said, you know what, we actually need to re-educate sponsors on the benefit of sponsorship, because like other things we mentioned, sponsors in the meantime, in the last 2 years, they've gone around, started doing other things, tried other things, and maybe they're even questioning the value of even going back and sponsoring events. And it's not even the case of having to, go out and win sponsors or convert sponsors from other events. The whole industry need to remind sponsors of the value that event sponsorships bring, which sounds to me like a very uphill struggle.
I agree with you. I think certainly, from what I'm hearing, sponsorship is being much more considered. That said, I'm also hearing, the feedback from a couple of the people in Latin America is that more brands are looking to get engaged with the industry. They see the opportunity to be connected with that community. I think one of the key points is around data, or data, depending where you come from and how you pronounce it. But I think data is key. And as an industry, we sit on massive amounts of data, but the number of sponsorship managers I speak to say that race organizers come to them and they've got no data to showcase, how they engage and even who the demographic is, but going way beyond that. I think as a generalization, sponsorship in mainstream sport and other areas is moving more towards performance-driven sponsorship as well. So that presents a challenge for our industry, but also an opportunity if you're prepared to engage and truly partner rather than, I try to use the term partnership rather than sponsorship. And if you build those real partnerships with the opportunity that you get rewarded for delivering on a bunch of KPIs and you work collaboratively towards that, and even around the data space, these small organizations that, don't necessarily have the tools or know-how, is there an opportunity for you to partner with your sponsor and say, yes, you obviously have to do it with all the compliance, but how can we analyze this data and what are the data points that would be valuable to you? And, can we use your back office because we don't have the resources or the know-how to deliver that? That means that we get rewarded as we go through, possibly.
Wrapping up, if we took a moment to look ahead, I know both of you earlier said that you expect somewhat of a stronger fall ahead. Where do you guys think we're going to be at in 6 months' time? And then how do you think, it's very early, I guess, but how do you think 2023 is going to unfold for the industry?
I think we're going to see kind of a steady kind of comeback, but it's going to take like a full 2 years in my mind, because I think that it just needs time for new organizations to come into the market, and for new events to kind of mature some. And I think it's going to take time for like the existing events to reconnect with their participants and their customers. But I think that it's going to come back. One of the things that everybody talked about kind of early in the pandemic was, look how many people are outside running. Man, there's going to be so many people that are going to come to the races. And that did not happen. because all those people running outside were kind of got used to running on their own, right? But I do think that there is a natural tendency, in spite of Facebook and TikTok and Instagram, that people do want to get together and people do want to commune and people do want to be a part of an event that has a greater purpose than just themselves. I think at the end of the day, that will win over everything. So hopefully we don't spend all of our lives in a metaverse and lose our ability to walk and things like that.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Bob's there. I think, we are creatures of community, and once people rediscover that love, I think there will be opportunities. Will it be 2 years or 3 years? I think it will definitely take time. The one thing that I've found, that the only thing that's consistent is inconsistency during this period of time. So as a generalization, the markets that I'm across are all so varied. So, some of them may come out of it in 6 months. Some of them may take 4 or 5 years to get out. If we're looking back on this, the glass half full, absolutely. It's an incredible opportunity for our industry. I think we need to tell the story better about what it is that we are, what are the problems we're selling and what is it that we're creating. Are we delivering races or events, or are we building communities? Are we delivering health and well-being to communities? What are the problems that as an industry we're solving? But I think there's an amazing future when it eventually reemerges. But I feel there's going to be some short-term pain before we get those amazing long-term gains. It's exciting as we look forward.
Let's hope when we regroup in 6 months' time or something that things are indeed going to be looking better, and there hasn't been another wave of COVID or whatever. I think we're running out of letters by now. Just to wrap up, do you want to maybe share some details with people of where they can find out a little bit more about your organizations and yourselves, and even if you're willing to share your email in case people want to get in touch about anything we've discussed or other stuff?
For us, it's runsignup.com, runsignup.blog. My email is bob.bickle@runsignup.com. And my personal website is bobbickle.com. So you can find me there. And that's B as in Bob, Ickel.
Awesome.
And if you send me an email and mention this podcast, I will send you $5 because I want to see if anybody actually listens this far in.
They do. Maybe they're not very keen to get in touch, but I'm sure they do.
I'm happy to match you there, Bob. So my email is chris@massparticipationworld.com. Send me an email. I'll send you a copy of my book, Mass Participation Sports Events, which I published in 2015. And connect with me. LinkedIn is probably my preferred platform, Chris-Rob. From an MPW perspective, massparticipationworld.com. Facebook page, LinkedIn pages for that. And yeah, delighted to help anyone in any way I can. As we've heard, we're passionate about this industry. It makes a massive impact on the health and well-being of humanity. And, I'd love to see it grow. And if there's anyone I can help wherever they are in the world, please don't hesitate to contact.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you very much both for taking the time to join me today. It's been very helpful in understanding where we are and some of the issues the industry is facing. I'm going to head off now and try to create as many fake email accounts as I can and start emailing Bob for those $5. No limits on that. I mean, it's all official. It's all on air. Thank you very much again.
Thanks so much for everything you do for our community. Seriously, you do a really nice job.
Absolutely. Panos, wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Keep up the great work.
Thank you, guys. I'll see everyone on our next podcast. I hope you enjoyed this market update episode with my guests, Mass Participation World's Chris-Rob and Run Signups' Bob Bickle. You can find more resources on anything and everything related to race directing on our website, racedirectorshq.com. You can also share your questions about today's discussion or anything else in our Facebook group, Race Directors Hub. Many thanks again to our awesome podcast sponsors, Run Signup and RaceCheck, for sponsoring today's episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe on your favorite player and check out our podcast back catalog for more great content like this. Until our next episode, take care and keep putting on amazing races.